Good afternoon. This is Honor Feedy. If you can hear my voice, we will be starting this webinar in 3 minutes.
The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon. My name is Honor Feedy and I'm with NAESP. I'd like to welcome you all to this afternoon's webinar on Preventing Bullying Part 2, Systematic Approaches. This is one of a two-part series that NAESP is offering on bullying. In our last webinar, Catherine Bradshaw took us through specific strategies for dealing with bullying, and this afternoon she and her co-presenter, Sandra Hardy, will talk to us about systematic approaches. Before we begin the webinar, I'd encourage all of you to download today's PowerPoint presentation and some specific resources that our speakers will mention off of our website at www.naesp.org/webinars. We also offer some book resources as well. But for this afternoon's presentation, we are so honored to have Catherine Bradshaw join us again on this topic of bullying. So the way we're going to handle questions, you've all been muted as you've come into the session. I would encourage you to open up the question box on your panel screen on the, that you have open, and feel free to type in questions as our speakers go through their presentation. We will then work those questions in and get them answered. We want to make sure that all of you feel comfortable with what's going on, and definitely have your questions heard and answered. We'll have some time there at the end as well. This also, just so you know, this webinar is only 1 hour, but we will be offering a pre-con workshop, an all-day workshop with Catherine Bradshaw at our conference in Nashville. So I encourage you, if you like these webinars, that you look into possibly coming to Nashville and seeing more of that. So let me just tell you a little bit about our speakers here. Catherine Bradshaw has a PhD and is professor and associate dean for research and faculty development at the Curry School of Education at the University of Virginia. She is also the deputy director of the Johns Hopkins Center for the Prevention of Youth Violence and the co-director of the Johns Hopkins Center for Prevention and Early Intervention. She holds a doctorate in developmental psychology from Cornell University and a master's of education in counseling and guidance from the University of Georgia. Her primary research interests focus on the development of aggressive behavior and school-based prevention. She collaborates on research projects examining bullying and school climate and the implementation of evidence-based prevention programs in schools. So I think she'll be able to offer a lot to us in terms of practical advice as far as helping us with bullying. Sandra Hardy is a coach for positive behavioral support, classroom management, and student engagement through Johns Hopkins University. She is a former teacher and has been working in Maryland Public Schools as a coach in elementary and middle schools on multiple research grants for over 6 years. She has a particular expertise in cultural proficiency, classroom management, and social-emotional learning. She leads professional development sessions and provides one-on-one coaching for teachers and consults with school-based teams on positive behavioral support and youth violence prevention approaches. So with that, I would like to thank you both very much for your time and expertise, and Catherine, I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thank you so very much for inviting us back. It was just about 2 weeks ago that we were here with you and reviewed a little bit of the background literature on bullying and its linkage with school climate. We had another one of our fabulous coaches from our team who was here with us. Today I'm thrilled to be joined by Sandy Hardy, and so she and I are going to move through some material as we discuss different strategies that are used around bullying prevention, particularly using a systematic approach. And as you mentioned, our first session, we really covered a little bit more about the background on bullying. What does it look like in our schools? What kind of forms of bullying do kids are they involved in? And tried to address questions like, is bullying really on the rise? And we were especially interested in its linkage with school climate, the way that schools create an environment that's either supportive for kids and creates a way that they feel that they can communicate with others and reach out to others for support, especially when they're not feeling very safe. And we focused on a variety of different strategies. We touched a little upon the positive behavior support strategy, but drilled down a little bit more in some of the other models like social-emotional learning and the Olweus Bullying Prevention Program, and concluded with some lessons learned from the work that we've been doing in a broad set of schools. Today we're going to pick back up on that theme around bullying and school climate and talk a little bit about what does it really mean to change the climate and the structures and the process within a school environment. You can't just flip a switch and expect that you're going to have an improved school climate or your school's going to improve its functioning just overnight. And so that type of change requires more of an investment about the way you set up and do business and the way that you interact with students and the kind of data systems and practices that you put in place. We're going to talk about a particular framework called positive behavior support, and you'll get very familiar with that throughout our dialogue today. Often it's referred to as positive behavioral interventions and support, or even sometimes school-wide effective behavior support or effective school-wide discipline. So it comes by a lot of different names, but hopefully as you hear from our examples and some of the literature that we draw upon, it might ring true for some of the schools that you've either been involved in the past or you've heard about from your colleagues. And we're going to drill down a little bit more and talk about what are some of the successful strategies that can be implemented using a three-tiered prevention logic. And we're going to conclude again with some lessons learned from the field. As we start talking about this issue, I want to talk a little bit more broadly than just about bullying, because when we start talking about prevention, bullying, and other kinds of problems, this quickly blows up to thinking more broadly about children's positive youth development and the prevention of a wide set of behavioral and mental health concerns. And as we think about a systems approach, we can think about the way that schools influence a wide set of characteristics of the children's social and character and emotional development, as well as their cognitive development, most obviously. But teachers are often experiencing a lot of these problems firsthand in the school. and are struck with, what do I do? And now there's a lot more legislative pressure on schools to provide a safe and orderly learning environment, and really thinking less about getting kids out of the classroom, but rather spending more time in the classroom. We can look at the history of special education and moving from self-contained settings to much more inclusive types of settings as an example of this shifting tide. And there's clearly an opportunity for prevention and early intervention. And we know from long history of research that the earlier you intervene in these problems, the more impactful those interventions are going to be. For example, some of the projects that Sandy and I have worked on use a classroom management strategy called the Good Behavior Game, a really pretty basic strategy that teachers can implement in only just a few minutes. But we have data showing that there are not just immediate impacts of this, but these kind of models can actually produce effects 10, even 20 years down the road on a broad set of outcomes, including completion of high school, cutting down on the number of kids that drop out of school, and also increasing the likelihood of kids getting jobs after they graduate, even after just 1 year of an effective classroom management system, primarily in the early elementary school years. So this illustrates the robustness and importance of early intervention and prevention. And schools are really an important system of care. As you start thinking about networking with other community-based mental health providers, you might hear this term, a system of care. And in fact, many agencies now, like the Department of Defense, are trying to link up more with schools and providing opportunities for grants that Department of Education and Department of Juvenile Justice are collaboratively funding to be able to stop that pipeline from school to prison. Is another terminology you hear a lot about, that pipeline. And this is really trying to think more about what are we doing in schools to prevent problems rather than just getting kids that have problems out of schools. And assessment and treatment are certainly part of that equation, but we need to think more systematically about what kind of data we're collecting on kids and how we're putting tools in the hands of educators and clinicians to be able to support kids in a positive, proactive way that's planful rather than reactive and punitive. But teachers need additional training, as do administrators, about how they can support this as our portfolio of expectations begins to increase from not only teaching reading and math, but how to teach responsibility and positive development and increasing the way that youth are interacting with adults in a positive way. And we actually have a pretty large body of research that we can draw upon. Some, like some of the studies we'll talk about today, have been tested very rigorously using experimental designs and have shown that when we're able to promote children's social and emotional skills through direct instruction and lessons that they can learn in real context and practice, that those can actually have very long-term as well as immediate impacts on cutting down on aggressive and disruptive behavior problems and improving academic performance. What we also need to do is make sure that kids have supportive relationships. What I refer to as connectedness. Kids feeling connected to the staff and to the parents in their school as well as at home, and that those supportive relationships are there when kids are bullied or when kids have problems, even sometimes when they're depressed or anxious, that they feel that there's someone else to help them. And we need to set strategies to reinforce the positive things that we see in kids. And positive behavior support is one of those comprehensive systems that helps with that. But there are no quick solutions. No one assembly or one professional development is going to be able to address all of this. We need to think more systematically about multi-year commitments to multi-component programs and combining what we're doing in the classroom with what we're doing school-wide and even into the community. Universal prevention efforts are strategies that we use with all kids, not just those that we're concerned about that are aggressive or already starting to have problems, but programs and strategies that we know that can improve the school climate and benefit all students. And that really serves as a solid foundation for building those more advanced tiers. And one of those advanced tier frameworks is called Positive Behavior Interventions and Supports. This type of approach has a long history of building on theoretical as well as empirical studies showing the importance of setting clear behavioral expectations, the way that kids learn from watching adults as well as watching each other, and the way that we set up and organize our school environment. We'll talk a little bit about this today as we drill down into some examples of how we can set clear behavioral expectations, like being ready, responsible, and respectful, They don't all have to start with ours, but it's kind of funny when we look across schools. Many of the schools are choosing kind of similar types of terms when they think about the kind of expectations that they want to have among their students at schools. There's also the importance of a recognition system, the way that we tell kids exactly what we want to see and reinforce them, because we know that what gets reinforced or rewarded is the thing that they're actually going to continue to do. So we'll talk a little bit more about these kind of reinforcement systems, and it's important to differentiate those from systems that might try to bribe kids or coerce them into things. No, it's really just about setting clear expectations and reinforcing those, so that way kids learn to internalize those positive expectations and set them for themselves as well as for others. And positive behavior support is a lot about changing the way adults are interacting with kids. In an ideal world, we wouldn't have to remind adults to reinforce those positive behaviors in kids. But we know being a principal as well as certainly being a teacher, and I know firsthand being a parent, can be a bit stressful. And so we need to think about ways that we as adults get reminded how to reinforce the positive behaviors, and also reminded of when we feel a little stressed or we feel that pinch or we feel a little bit of tension in our work with students, that we have good strategies, good research-based strategies that we can use to respond in a pro-social, proactive way to correct the behavior rather than in a punitive and exclusive type of approach. And using data and getting buy-in from a variety of participants in the school, including kids, is a really important part of that process. These kinds of models can be implemented in any type of school. Today, obviously, we're talking a little bit more about elementary schools because of our target audience here. But you might have experience or have communicated with some of your colleagues working in middle, high school, even alternative school settings. In fact, at Johns Hopkins, in the inpatient unit for adolescents who are struggling with psychological problems, they've actually been using these kind of strategies and found that even in that really intense kind of environment, these kind of school-wide type of strategies can cut down on serious behavior problems, even among our most troubled kids. In fact, they found data from that study that they were able to cut down on the number of kids that required physical or medical restraints in those very rare situations, but intense ones. Coaching is critical, and that's why I'm so pleased to have Sandy Hardy on the call. She's one of our expert coaches and has been a coach for nearly a decade now in a variety of different contexts, working hand on hand with teachers and shoulder to shoulder with others about the high quality implementation of these kinds of approaches. And this really does go back to that public health type of framework. You can see the green to yellow to red triangle on the right-hand side. That's where we talk about different tiers or levels of intervention, where we think more about proactive prevention-based approaches rather than punitive and reactive approaches. I'll talk a little bit more about that as we start to unpack this model. But let's start first about how do we set expectations, set up a recognition system for our students. And you can see this diagram, this Venn diagram. We talk about three core elements of the positive behavior support model. And one is really just trying to get the systems in place. What are the processes that we use to set positive expectations among students? What are the practices? Like what kind of strategies and actual activities, training are needed to facilitate more positive change in students? And what kind of data do we collect to determine the impact of our interventions? And all this really leads to outcomes. Quite often, some of our outcomes we're talking about are cutting down on bad things, like bullying, kids skipping class, or being disrespectful for teachers. But other outcomes include positive things, like students being engaged and performing academically well and being inclusive to their students, showing empathy. A lot of those other skills, behaviors that we want to reinforce in all of our students. Here's an example from MacArthur, actually one of the schools Sandy's working in now. When they first launched their initiative several years ago, they put out what their EAGLE code was. And here they used be responsible, respect yourself, and respect others. So you can see how those broad set of behavioral expectations really can encompass a broad set of things within a school. Being responsible certainly can relate to bullying, for example. Being responsible to your friends is reporting when you have concerns that a friend's being bullied, helping them get assistance from an important staff member when you do suspect that bullying has gone on. Respecting yourself, for example, in the case of bullying, when somebody does start bullying you, one way to respect yourself is to tell yourself that you don't really deserve to be treated this way and that you need to get help from somebody else to stop that behavior. And certainly respecting others directly relates to cutting down on bullying, because if you're respectful for others, you're not going to bully them or try to coerce them into doing things. And when you see bullying, you're going to act on it and really try to intervene to stand up for someone. Here's another example. This is from a slightly older student population, and you can see how they built it into a display case within the school. These are foreman, students, and staff. What's really interesting there is you see the expectation pertains not just to students, but also to the staff, that we want staff to live up to these expectations too, to create a broader climate of positive behavior support within the school. And back to MacArthur's Equal Code, what we do want to do is highlight how this is relevant in all settings across the school. Here, this is a behavioral matrix where we've outlined what does it look like to be responsible in the classroom versus the hallway or the cafeteria. We don't have bathroom on here, but that's also a really important area to be posting these behavioral expectations. And the bus is certainly a critical one, especially as we think about issues related to bullying. And what I like to do when I'm trying to teach these with kids is actually put up a blank one of these and then get kids to write out under each of those headings of the behavioral expectations and the different areas, what does it look like to them using their words and things they're concerned about to be responsible in the classroom or the hallway or the cafeteria. I remember one time I was going over this with a 5th grade classroom in Western Maryland, and we were talking about what does it mean to be respectful. And I remember one kid stood up and said, it means no kickbacks in the lunch line. And I said, kickbacks in the lunch line? What does that mean? And I was initially thinking they were paying somebody to get ahead of line. But no, it was actually a kid standing in line, and they would kick each other from behind, injure each other in the shins. I would never have thought about that as a concern for these kids, but it was essentially a form of bullying or aggression that they were experiencing. And so we tried to turn that around. What does it mean to be respectful for others in the cafeteria? In many cases, they start off thinking of don't do this, don't do kickbacks, but what we said is keep your hands and your feet to yourself. That was a way that kids were able to put something that was really important to them that they were concerned about on the behavioral matrix. Here's just another example to be able to see the range of types of things that schools creatively put together. And I think the best use of these are really when you are able to involve students in being able to define what the behavioral expectations are. And as we move forward and we think about ways to reinforce them, because we adults can think about what's reinforcing for us. In fact, many of the adults say getting a good parking spot or getting to leave the day a little bit early or having a colleague or principal cover their class when they're a little bit burnt out or just need an afternoon off. But kids, sometimes they need other kinds of reinforcers. In fact, even adults like to feel appreciated for the work that they do. And so part of that process is creating a tangible reinforcer. This is pretty easy for us to think about at the elementary and middle. Sometimes at high school we have to be a little bit more creative. But here you can see on the MacArthur example, they broke out each of the expectations, being responsible, respect yourself or respecting others, and then they wrote in the student's name as well as the teacher's name, because this now becomes a piece of data that they can track to make sure that they're using enough of these reinforcers, both to see, is Jessica, how many is she getting, and how many is Miss Friend handing out? Is she really implementing these in the classroom? And it's not just merely handing these out, but it's really using them as a reminder to have that positive exchange with students and saying directly what the behavior is that you saw in them and that they're being reinforced for. That's why the responsibility is checked off here. So we move on and think about other examples. Here's one. We actually touched upon this example a little bit last time when we were thinking about some of the examples of positive behavior support in another school called Park Heights area. And here it's the Pimlico Stallions. You can see they have be respectful, be responsible, and be safe. And they lump this together under their code of conduct. You can see different examples. The stallion bucks are the way that they actually reinforce that. And you can see the tracker system with students' names on there where they can count and cash them in actually at a school store. You can see different denominations on the Pimlico Stallion bucks, $5, $10, and that will allow them to reinforce different types of behaviors they want to see. And a lot of this is just making sure that adults are consistent in the way they're interacting in a positive way with students. And one of those areas of inconsistency we often see is that teachers don't really know what kind of problems are they supposed to manage on their own in the classroom or with some support of training or other kinds of structures of reinforcement that they can use. But what kind of problems might actually need to be sent to the office? In some schools, coming to class unprepared and not having enough materials could actually warrant a teacher sending a kid to the office. But we don't want that to vary across classrooms. We want it to be pretty consistent and predictable for our students. And so here's an example of one of these flowcharts about what kind of behavior problems are managed in the office and what kind of problems are managed by the teacher. And you can see this serves as a really detailed example of different strategies, listing out exactly what can be done that the teacher can follow when they experience these different types of behavior problems. And you've got some pretty serious things on this list, like alcohol, drugs, gambling. In fact, most of those, like weapons, are probably addressed through your code of conduct. But even some of the classroom managed things, like failure to serve at detention or putting other students down or refusing to do work, that might be one of those where you really have teachers that don't understand where that threshold is or that line. And down at the bottom, you can see there's a minor incident report form. And some schools will set up expectations whereby 3 of those minor reports actually translates into a referral into the office. But these kind of tools can serve as a really important conversation starter with the adults about how classroom problems are managed and the role of the office in supporting that. And using data is critical for that. We can talk about different types of data, like positive strategies, like the use of those reinforcements and tickets, but we can also think about office discipline referrals. In fact, the school-wide positive behavior support model often uses a system called School-Wide Information System, SWIS, to be able to manage that data around office discipline referrals. And it creates really nice data, but only if you track what's coming into the system in a consistent way. So here's one of those Swiss-compatible office referral forms. And you can access the Swiss system online by going to www.swis.org and be able to review this kind of data system. I have no proprietary motivation for putting this out there other than I know that a lot of schools that we're working with really find a lot of value from using a consistent system to be able to track office discipline referrals. And that includes the problem behavior, possible motivators, because this helps us start thinking functionally about why might that student be avoiding doing work. Is it because they don't understand the task, or is it because they're trying to get attention? And what is the decision? And then other aspects like where did it happen and time of day. And then they can create, through the Swiss system, different types of graphs. So for example, here's one on the top upper left-hand side about tracking office referrals by location. You don't have to have a PhD in statistics to be able to see that most of the referrals are coming from the classroom. And that might be expected because, in fact, students spend more time in the classroom than they do any other area. But you can see the next area is playground. Relative to the classroom or other settings, they spend considerably less time in the playground. It suggests that we need to really increase the monitoring that's happening there. On the upper right-hand side, you can see number of referrals by time of day. So it's pretty clear there's a lot of activity happening in the early part of the day. So maybe this school really needs to think about its transition and setup, or something as simple as providing supports for kids to get ready and oriented and reviewing the behavioral expectations each morning so that way they know what's expected of them. The next data is actually graphing by teacher, because we know some teachers might be more reliant on writing up office referrals. So this might suggest that we need to target individual teachers that are having high rates of office referrals. It could very well be because they have more challenging students, but it also could be that they need a broader set of tools in their toolkit to be able to manage those problems. And the next graph is really about the number of office referrals individual students get. What we start thinking about students that are clearly not responding to the strategies teachers are trying, and that office referrals aren't working for those kids. We need to think more in that tiered approach about how we can support them. And in fact, that 3-tiered model is really an ideal framework for thinking about higher needs students. And we pull most directly from the public health framework. But on the left-hand side of this figure here, you can see we do this already when we think about academics. When you're teaching math, usually you cover one lesson, and maybe 80% of the kids will get it that first time. Then there are going to be some kids that just don't understand it. They need a little more one-on-one work or even small group work, homework clubs to make sure that that skill is really reinforced. But then there are going to be some students that really need quite a bit more intensive support and coaching, a lot more intensive one-on-one work, maybe even some individual tutoring. And that's more that top tier, that 1 to 5% that's going to need the intensive support. But the same thing happens when we're trying to teach behavioral expectations. Maybe 80% of your students are going to get it the first time you teach being safe, responsible, and ready to learn. But there are going to be other students that are going to need more intensive types of supports. What we start thinking about is yellow and red zone types of supports that map onto the unique needs. And you're probably already using some of these systems in your own school. Maybe you could take a moment to think a little bit about what are you doing for supporting green zone types of activities? What kind of instruction are all students getting that is preventative and proactive in nature? What about those students, the yellow zone types of activities? Those fence sitter kids, the kids that can look really, really green one day and start looking kind of red the next if the environment isn't predictable. And then the more intensive needs students. Some of these students might come to school just not ready to really engage because of their family environment or the community context or other things that are going on in their individual setting. I'm going to also highlight some of the lessons that we've learned from the state of Maryland. Maryland's one of about 44 states that has really scaled up this positive behavior support model. We have multiple levels of support that we provide all the way down to the individual student in the classroom and then more broadly at the district level and the state level. So in Maryland, we've trained over 900 teams, and that's about 65% of our schools are already implementing that Tier 1 level of positive behavior support. Each school has a team leader and a team that facilitates the implementation in the school. And each has a coach, like Sandy, that works with them. Sometimes that coach is employed by the school, and sometimes it works with the district or even travels from one school to another. We've trained over 500 coaches in the state of Maryland. In each of our districts, we have 24 in the state of Maryland, has a positive behavior support coach or coordinator that really oversees that broader implementation and provides support to principals and coaches to make sure the model is implemented with high fidelity and helps to monitor that fidelity data. We have a state team that includes our State Department of Education, as well as some of our university partners like at Johns Hopkins and Shepherd Pratt Health System, which is a mental health provider. And they're interested not only in that top tier, but even what are we doing to try to prevent behavior and mental health problems before they start. And at the national level, I really hope you'll reach out to the National PBIS Technical Assistance Center. It's funded by the U.S. Department of Education's Office of Special Education Programs, and they have locations all across the country, Oregon, Connecticut, and Missouri, to be able to provide support and technical assistance around positive behavior support. You can access their website at www.pbis.org. In Maryland, we've trained, as I said, over 900 schools, but that didn't happen overnight. In fact, you can see from this diagram here when we started rolling out this model, in the beginning we only trained a handful of schools. And in fact, some of those had to get retrained because we didn't have a good coaching support system in place. But then over time, we've really caught on to the number of schools that have been trained. This next diagram shows the number of schools broken down by different school type. And in fact, we have more elementary schools than any other type in the state. And thus, naturally, we've spent more time focusing on elementary schools' implementation of positive behavior support. But we do have some combination elementary middles and middles, as well as high schools, that are also implementing these types of models. And our team at Johns Hopkins has been doing a lot of research on this model because it might look and feel pretty good, but unless it's actually producing outcomes, we really don't want to recommend it to other schools. And in fact, using rigorous designs where we've randomly assigned some schools to get access to the training and coaching and others that have served as comparison over multiple years, we've been able to see that PBIS demonstrates really impactful changes in the types of systems that schools are able to implement as it relates to providing professional development for teachers and providing reinforcements for students and putting in those three-tiered types of framework. In fact, even after just 1 year, 66% of our schools actually reached high implementation fidelity. Some schools it did take even 2 or 3 years, especially those that have more challenging community contexts or have high rates of turnover of administrator or principals. But Over the 5 years that we were studying this particular model, we found that all schools reached and sustained high-fidelity implementation when they had good coaching and good leadership. In terms of the impacts for school climate, we found significant improvements in the way staff members felt that they were getting support from their principals, as well as the way that the school was functioning. We used a measure called organizational health and school climate, where we were able to look across a broad range of outcomes like principal leadership, collegial relationships, students' focus on academics over discipline problems, the school's ability to leverage resources, and the way that they interacted with their community, as well as their overall school climate and functioning. We saw significant improvements in all of those areas. In fact, when I'm talking to different teacher groups, even principals, they're often very excited about these findings. While we're often so focused on student outcomes, these intermediate outcomes, like improving the school environment for staff, is so critical because staff are really not going to be able to focus on students if they don't feel supported in that environment. And sometimes we did find that schools that were a little more challenged from the beginning took them a little bit longer to implement positive behavior support, but in fact they actually improved the most over time. When we talk about student outcomes, we saw significant impacts across a range of areas, including reductions and suspensions. The drop in office referrals was by 1/3, and we also saw significant improvements in standardized test performance indicated by math as well as reading achievement. And we saw significant reductions on teachers' ratings of student behavior in the classroom, including their rates of rejecting bullying behavior, both as a perpetrator as well as a victim, and the number of kids that were requiring more intensive support. And this is really where we can save some money when we start cutting down on the number of children that are inappropriate referred for services. We really want to reserve those kinds of services, like special education services, for students that have the greatest needs. But by no way do we ever want to deny students those kind of support services when they genuinely need them. Rather, we want to put in place strategies to try to prevent behavior problems before they escalate to the level of more intense service need. We also found reductions in problems like concentration problems where students get really distracted or really disruptive, and improvements in positive things like their ability to interact in a positive or empathic way towards each other, as well as their ability to regulate their emotions, to calm down when they're upset, or cope effectively with stress. In fact, we saw some of these effects were even strongest among our younger elementary school students, suggesting the earlier you roll these models out, the better they are. We also saw that our higher risk kids actually the ones that improved the most. Some of our kids that didn't get any office referrals from the beginning, they really weren't going to probably get a lot of office referrals. But those fence sitters, especially the ones that we think about having yellow and red zone types of needs, we actually saw that even just implementing these universal strategies, those kids improved significantly. They were less likely to be sent to the principal's office, less likely to need counseling types of services or more intensive social skills services, and less likely to be sent to special education. When we move into the more advanced tiers, thinking about the student supports that are needed for students that do get referred on to the special education teams or student support teams, we found that providing a little bit more training and coaching to those teachers really improved their self-efficacy or their ability to manage behavior problems in the classroom. And this comes from another study that we did where we had schools that were all implementing that Tier 1, but we provided coaching and additional support using a model called PBIS Plus, the plus being implementing those Tier 2 types of supports. And we found impacts also on the teacher's ability to manage the classroom, cutting down on the number of classroom-based support services that those teachers required, as well as the number of children that were referred on to special education. And similarly, we saw improvements in academic achievement by providing those first 2 layers of positive behavior support. I'm going to turn it over now to Sandy, who's going to talk a little bit more about an ongoing project that we have called Double Check, where we use this framework of positive behavior support to try to address a broader set of needs around cultural proficiency in our teachers. Because we know, sadly, that students from disadvantaged backgrounds are often more likely to be sent to the office and receive higher rates of referrals for special education. And our framework, we're using this positive behavior orientation to try to address this through classroom management and intensive training on other strategies for engaging diverse learners in the classroom using a culturally sensitive lens. Sandy?
Thank you, Catherine. As she mentioned, I've been a coach for almost 10 years now in different systems, and this Double Check project is one that I've been working on for the last 3 years. It's a grant-funded project currently in 12 elementary and middle schools in one district in Maryland. It emphasizes cultural proficiency, student engagement, classroom management, and we know that it's quite a complex issue, so there's a lot of different areas that we focus on. Next slide, please. So what we work on, what's really great about this project is that I'm able to work within a school on various levels. So I'm able to support the whole staff by providing professional development. And then I'm also able to work with teams within the school. I attend school-wide PBIS meetings. I attend SIT meetings. I attend any other kinds of support meetings that I can attend that I have time for. And then I also provide one-on-one coaching with the classroom checkup. Next slide. The themes for our core professional development modules, of course we use acronyms in Education for Everything. It helps us to remember things a lot better. And so we use the acronym of CARES. We focus our professional development on these 5 ideas and that we implement for the entire staff. We have connection to the curriculum, which we emphasize a model called the 5 C's. We've done a lot of research on all of the strategies that we use within our professional development sessions. And that is another unique thing about our project, is that we are strategy and skill focused. We talk about the importance of authentic relationships that teachers need to build with the families and with the students in their classroom, and what it really means to have a true authentic relationship. Reflective thinking is the thread that goes through everything, and we talk about function-based thinking with that, which is slightly different than an FBA, but it is a way for students or for teachers to start to really analyze what it is that maybe their students are trying to tell them. Effective communication, of course, is important, and that's with students and with parents and families as well. And then acknowledging the role that culture has on learning and being sensitive to the various cultures that the students bring within the building. When we go down to the coaching level and we work on the classroom checkup system, you'll see there are basically 5 steps to this. Next slide, please. So there are, when we coach individual teachers, we have to also model some of these professional development ideas with those teachers. We first build on a relationship with them, and that's done through a teacher interview. It's called a teacher interview, but it's pretty informal. It's a get-to-know-you type of session where we have an opportunity to learn a little bit about their background and to learn how they run their class and what kind of makes them tick. Then they complete an ecology checklist for us that helps us to identify what they believe is going on in their classroom, and it informs us when we get into the last piece or the 3rd step of this, when we give them feedback and we're able to tell them that we did or did not maybe agree with some of their own perceptions of the classroom. We go in and we conduct classroom visits, also known as observations. We just put a different kind of term on it to make it a little bit more informal. But we'll go in maybe 3 to 4 times to various classroom settings to be able to gather all kinds of data that we can use to then inform a personalized feedback session for each individual teacher. Through that session, we develop a menu of options of different ideas that a teacher could use to develop a goal plan or an action plan where they're going to focus on one particular area of interest within their classroom that they want to work on to help improve their classroom environment. And then from there, we work on how they can monitor the daily implementation, and we provide continuing support as a coach. Now, having worked in several school settings, there's been a lot of lessons that I've learned. Not only was I a teacher in a middle school that implemented PBIS, but I also coached in some elementary schools that had varying levels of PBIS implementation. Some were just beginning and some had been in the project for years, and then continue to coach in more elementary and middle schools that have varying levels of implementation. So next slide, please. So there are a lot of things as a principal that you can do to help support the project. I think, next slide please, the most important thing is that as a principal you set and model expectations yourself. You have to adopt a proactive framework and belief in addressing discipline. So instead of being reactive, you're proactive. But it's also important to model this with your staff regularly. So within staff meetings, you can celebrate staff who are achieving in areas within their classroom. I've seen lots of different examples of this happen within schools where there's been, if you remember that there was, MacArthur was doing respect and responsibility, and I've seen in schools before where they would have a symbol that represented each of their elements from their PBIS expectations, and then staff would present them to each other. Staff who were being exemplary and being responsible and respecting others and respecting themselves. And so that's just a way to tie it in so not only adults are responsible for it, but they understand how it can actually make a student feel to be recognized for doing things that only help to improve the climate within a building and within a classroom. It's important to tie PBIS also to your SIT goals. Having PBIS members be on your SIT team and to help support and include that within your plan is going to help make sure that it's monitored and to keep it going and to reinforce it regularly with your staff. Next slide. When you are creating your team, your PBIS team, it's really important that you include a wide variety of people on that team. Not only do you want your regular education teachers who are going to be the ones who probably implement it on a moment-to-moment basis, but your special educators who are supporting instruction, other support staff, including office staff. Having an administrator be an active member on the team is also very important because they can help to provide data and things like that that maybe others aren't privy to and can't bring to the meeting in other ways. It's also important to invite community members and students to be a part of the team. The students are going to tell you more about what it is that they want and what they're going to respond to. And it may seem to go against what you're used to, but including and inviting skeptics from the school to be a part of the team is also going to help you to create a more cohesive team and to provide some supports and get some insight so that you can help tackle some of the issues that some of your staff might be bringing up and have with implementing PBIS. Next slide, please. It's also important that data is used in an efficient and timely manner. So if you're using, Catherine showed us an example of an office referral that can be easily implemented into this school-wide information system that helps to really inform decision-making around some of the data elements and discipline issues that are going on within the school. But it's important that that information is actually input on a regular basis. Assigning one person with that task to input that data, they can do that on a every other day basis or on a weekly basis. They can input that information so that it's almost real-time information so that issues can be addressed immediately. It's also important, and I've seen it too often, where data is pushed to the end of a meeting and then it doesn't get reviewed. If it doesn't get reviewed, then you're not going to be able to really focus on some of the issues that might be happening within the school, within the classrooms, in different settings, and so that you won't really be able to address that. So it's important to move data to the beginning of meeting agendas so that it does not get overlooked. Next slide, please. It's also important that as you make these decisions, the whole staff needs to be included in how those decisions are being reached. So being transparent with the staff of here's the issue, here's the approach that we came to, and this is why. This is how we're going to best support our students. This is how we're best going to support our staff, and this is what we're looking for to prove that it has been effective. And then going back and re-examining that information within a timely manner, maybe within the next month, to see if there's been any kinds of gains made. And inviting regular staff feedback, whether it's through quick surveys or through team meetings where people can express some of their concerns, as well as, again, their celebrations and their successes with it, so that that can be shared with others who may be struggling with how to implement PBIS within their classroom. Next slide, please. So then consistency becomes the real important piece, and that's with anything. Being consistent with the reward system that you're using for the students is important. If you're using bucks or some kind of cash or some kind of rewards like what Catherine showed towards the beginning, or Eagle tickets, then you're going to want to make sure that it's something that teachers can be able to distribute very easily and without having to think of it too much. I've seen teachers have rings where they have paper coins simply hole punched onto these rings so that they can easily rip them off and give them to students. I've seen them also come in little ticket books, so they've been able to give out tickets very quickly to students in a way that is not taking away from instruction, and it doesn't have to be thought about too much. It's important to understand, too, that PBIS is not just about monthly celebrations for students. It is an important piece, celebrating your students and celebrating the improvement in discipline, which improves the environment and feeling of safety within your buildings, is very important. But it's important that your staff understands, and you understand as well, that PBIS is not just about having these monthly or quarterly celebrations, but how did you actually get to those monthly and quarterly celebrations? Why are you actually having those? And using the data to help support why those are actually happening, so that you're not leaving all of that behind. Unfortunately, I've seen that trap happen a couple of times where the PBIS team becomes party planners as opposed to really focusing on data, in which case you're not helping to, you're not using the system to the best of what it can offer. Next slide, please. You also need to think about how it might be the best ways to support your staff, whether it's creating professional development workshops that address specific behaviors, peer walkthroughs where they can look for specific things that are happening in the classroom, not just things that aren't going well, but things that are going well, so that those things can be shared, because some teachers aren't even aware of the things that they're doing well. Administrative walkthroughs that could be done in a way that's not evaluative, but done more collaboratively in a supportive manner. And being honest with the staff and talking to the teachers about what an office-managed referral is and what classroom-managed behavior might be, and linking that to the research so that your staff can be well-informed, and then helping them to kind of figure out the hierarchy and coming up with a strategic plan that can be implemented within each classroom and followed almost like a discipline ladder, so that teachers can figure out a new way to work with students who might be causing some disruptions or problems within their classroom. Next slide. Lastly, it's this proactive planning. So if you are using a recognition system for students, such as the Eagle tickets or some kind of cash or bucks type of system, then, like I said, it has to be easily manageable for teachers. But if you need to also make sure that if you're providing an opportunity for them to use these things, it extends beyond the classroom. So you can have hallway bucks for quiet lines. You can have class rewards for different things, such as cafeteria cash for clean tables. And so it expands beyond just an individual student, and it extends beyond the classroom as well. Planning lessons collaboratively as a staff that can be taught by all teachers when first implementing PBIS is one way to also streamline it within the school. So you could have all teachers at 9 o'clock on Monday morning teach about this certain expectation and what it means and how that translates to their classroom. As we know, expectations translate differently from first grade to fifth grade or from art class to music class. And so teachers have different expectations, and they need to be able to share that with their students so that their students can be successful. And then reiterating that on a regular basis. We can't assume that just because our students have been told once what the expectation is that they're going to be able to do it without reminders. So reminding them and being consistent with that is important. And then planning ahead with celebrations. That is a key piece to this, is recognizing things. And so if you're having celebrations quarterly, it's best to plan them well in advance, so that it might be that for one quarter, it's if you're having issues with students being late to class, if you want to address that, and students who are on time 90% of the time will then receive this quarterly incentive, then that needs to be brought to attention to the students in the beginning of the quarter so that they have time to be able to meet that expectation and can be successful with that, because your goal is to get as many students as possible to be able to participate in these celebrations as well. So planning ahead and figuring out what kinds of resources you need for that is going to be crucial in order for that to be successful. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it back over to Catherine to kind of sum up what we've talked about today.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Sandy, for sharing your insights and your many lessons learned from working with schools. I know when we talked about this, we had said, well, what are the top 5 things? And then the list grew to be 10. And then you put together 15. But it seems like there's a lot of lessons learned here. I think one theme that we didn't really bring out as much, but I'd like to touch on here at the end, is the role of families, as well as the youth voice. Sometimes folks feel like when they hear about these models that it seems like, oh gosh, there's so much on the shoulders of the staff to do this, and we're already asking teachers to do so many things. But I think parents can really play an important role, especially as we think about how the reinforcement system or getting incentives and getting the PTA involved. Some of our schools also create a behavioral matrix that helps translate into the home environment. So one of our schools put together refrigerator magnets that set up what the school expectation rules are, and then actually map them onto what that would look like at their house and their kitchen and their bedroom, other kind of places in their home. So that way it showed that the kids were learning to extend those skills and those expectations to the home environment. So that's a really nice way to give that connection there. And you can also have students be part of this system, and having a student subcommittee that might help give ideas for the labeling of the expectations or cool ideas that are fun for them around recognition and celebrations. So those are other ways. Some schools even think about rolling this out just to the staff first, so that way they practice. What does it look like to be respectful to each other in the staff meeting space or in the staff bathrooms or in the staff parking lot, so that way they can really start to own the model. And we want to make sure that we reinforce the good behavior that the staff are displaying to each other, because that does certainly model it for students. There are a number of resources that might be helpful for you all as you're thinking about rolling out these models. The one that I think is really the best around this is the National PBIS Technical Assistance Center. I mentioned that www.pbis.org. There are tons of free resources that are available. In Maryland, we also have our own website. If you're interested in checking out some examples from different states, Maryland's is www.pbismaryland, all one word, .org. And there are a lot of resources. One thing that's really nice about the PBIS community is there's so much sharing of free resources and kind of creative stealing, where people are putting up PowerPoints of how do they roll this out in their school, what is a behavioral matrix, what are some lessons that teachers have used in other schools, and sharing those with each other. So it's a really nice community, because most of the materials, in fact nearly all of the materials through the National PBIS Center, are free. There are some models that others have developed that there's a charge for that you can also check out, but I want to make sure you're aware of some of those resources that are research-based but are also free. And as we link back to some of the other resources more generally on bullying, there's some information on the website. The National Association of School Psychologists, they just had their big conference last week, and Sandy was there as part of it, and our team actually presented some of our research that we shared with you all today at that conference. But they have a number of good resources available online. And a related model is called Social-Emotional Learning, and the Collaborative for Academic Social and Emotional Learning, referred to as CASEL, also has some really good resources for thinking about particularly areas for student engagement and teaching those softer skills around empathy and communication, emotion regulation that are a good fit with the positive behavior support framework. And others that are a little bit more focused in areas of violence prevention or positive youth development, as well as substance abuse and mental health focus, are available at those last two links there. And some of the resources that we had posted on the website, there's a brief little two-pager, as I like to call it, that came out a little over a year ago that's a quick summary of some of the research and basic core elements of positive behavior support. That might be a really early way for you to think about rolling this out in your school, communicating with your staff, because as we discussed, both of us said you got to get buy-in from your staff before you roll this out. And you really need to get in touch with a trained implementers who can help you get trained in the model and really can help you identify a coach in your area to be able to work with. So hopefully many of you are connected up with a school district or a state that has a positive behavior support implementation arm and can assist with that. The other article is a little bit of a review about how the positive behavior support framework can be used to address issues related to bullying more specifically. So that covers some of the themes that we talked about today, as well as in the first part of our session. So I think with that, Sandy, any closing remarks from you or closing suggestions for our audience?
No, I just think it's really important that as a principal, if you're going to implement PBIS, then you also model all of the elements of that and truly believe in what it can do for your school as well.
Thank you.
I think part of that is from the very beginning having that buy-in and having that conversation. Sometimes it actually takes schools a couple of years to really get buy-in. We see that a little bit more in our high school settings than we do in our elementary school. Usually in elementary schools, the teachers are pretty oriented towards the needs around children with behavioral and social-emotional skills development. So that's usually a pretty easy sell, so to speak, at the elementary school level. So hopefully that'll be a little bit of motivation for you all to think about rolling this out in your school. Honor, anything from you as we wrap up?
This has been just a great webinar. You've given us so many resources and things and tips to think about. I agree with you. I think buy-in is really key when the PBIS model. And you hit on one particular point that I thought you mentioned the principal contacting a trained coach first. And I thought that was a really great point to make in terms of their own, because you said if the principal isn't bought into it themselves, then how can they carry that forth to the staff. So what resource, where did you say that they could find trained coaches perhaps and to contact?
Yeah, at the www.pbis.org website, there's a listing of the different states. The TA Center really doesn't want to train an individual school. They want to connect them up with other schools and other districts that are doing the work. And so that's really the best way to figure out who's the PBIS contact in your area, because that'll help you network with other schools that you could share materials. And I think one of the most influential things is to be able to do a walkthrough, go through another school that's implementing this model. There are also a lot of materials that are available online at that website, even some videos that you can be able to learn more about. In fact, there are even some great videos that kids have put together where they're describing what this looks like in their school.
And the other point that I thought you hit that I thought was very important for our audience to realize is that it's not all on the principal's shoulders, that it really should be distributed. This needs to be bought in by everyone. So maybe utilizing and bringing these resources to everyone, and then as a school deciding as a staff that this is the model that they want to go through. I assume that that's probably the best approach, right?
Exactly, and there's a blueprint for implementation of positive behavior support, and one of the first things is a readiness checklist, because you don't want to do a launch unless you're really ready. and there's suggestions in there about getting that buy-in and forming a team. And in fact, usually the way we do implementation in Maryland is we can't really have everybody in the whole building come together for 2 or 3 days of training. So really the more intensive training happens to that team lead. And so the team leadership, including a principal or an assistant principal, and 4 or 5 other members of the team all get together, and they serve as that leadership team for positive behavior support. So it certainly is not on the shoulders of the principal. But the principal does need to be there at the table. Sandy and I can cite example after example of situations where a principal has just said, oh, we're going to do this, and then stepped away from the table. And it's very clear that while there's a little bit of a directive there, there isn't real ownership and buy-in from the principal. So I think having an authentic leader who's involved in the process and willing to roll up their own sleeves but work with the team for implementation is really the most successful model.
Well, thank you very much to both of you. I hope you've all enjoyed this session today. This session is being recorded and will be available on the NAESP website. And please come to our conference and hear more from Catherine, as they didn't have much time to get into these things, but I'm sure you're going to be spending a lot more time. So thank you all very much for coming. I encourage you to visit our next webinar on Grit, Mindset, and Determination, the Key to Leading by Influence by Jim Grant on April 9th. With that, I will sign off and wish you all a good afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.